The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her, but the blizzard broke the world first. For the Blackwood Pack, the two events felt like the same unfolding tragedy. First, the loss of their future, then the loss of their young. The great hall, usually roaring with the warmth of 100 bodies, was a cavern of cold stone and colder grief. A keening sorrow, sharp as the wind outside, echoed off the high, timbered ceilings. King Rorik stood on the dais, a figure carved from ice and shadow. He did not keen, he did not weep. He watched his people mourn their lost pups, the two youngest children of his beta, Dachshund, and felt nothing but the familiar, gnawing frost that lived beneath his skin. It was a curse, a cold that had been leaching the warmth from his bloodline for 3 generations. It had taken his father's heart, and now it was coming for his. He could feel it in the utter stillness of his soul as his pack fractured with sorrow. The 2 pups, barely old enough to shift, had wandered from the stronghold during the first flurries. Now, 3 days into the worst blizzard the Northern Territories had seen in a century, all hope was extinguished. They were gone. The morning ceremony was a formality, a way to channel the agony into ritual. Outside the fortress walls, in a forgotten hovel pressed against the scullery's outer wall, Elara knew nothing of ceremonies. She knew only the cold. She was human, an omega, a stray taken in years ago to perform the tasks no one else wanted. She was less than a servant, a ghost haunting the edges of the pack's awareness. Her life was a study in being overlooked, in making herself small and silent to survive. But she had a secret, a tiny, defiant spark of warmth that lived in her core. It was a strange, internal fire that had kept her from freezing to death as a child, and now kept the bitter chill of her lonely existence at bay. It was a useless, hidden thing, until today. Hours ago, drawn by a sound only she could hear, a desperate, fading whimper on the wind, she had done the unthinkable. She had left the relative safety of the fortress walls and walked into the white fury of the storm. She had followed the sound, her own small warmth, a pathetic shield against the raging blizzard, her feet sinking into snow that would have frozen a shifter solid in minutes. She had found them. The 2 pups huddled in the hollow of a fallen log, their fur stiff with ice, their breathing shallow and weak. They were dying. Any sane person would have turned back, saved themselves. But Elara was not sane. She was an omega who had never been shown kindness and did not know how to withhold it. She had crawled into the hollow with them. She had wrapped her thin arms around their small, shivering bodies, and she had called upon her secret fire. She had focused not on saving herself, but on them. The warmth that was usually a flicker grew, pouring from her skin like a tangible presence. It melted the ice from their fur. It seeped into their little bodies, coaxing their hearts into a stronger rhythm. For hours she held them, a human furnace in the heart of a frozen world, until their shivering stopped and they were sleeping, safe and warm against her. Now, carrying 1 pup in her arms and the other clinging to her back, she stumbled toward the sounds of grief emanating from the great hall. The wind tore at her threadbare cloak, but inside her cocoon of shared warmth, the pups were safe. The massive oak doors, barred against the storm, were her final obstacle. She didn't have the strength to knock. She simply collapsed against them. The doors shuddered. Then, with a great groan of protesting iron, they were thrown open from the inside by guards thinking the storm was trying to break through. And there she stood, a wraith of snow and ice, her face pale and frost-kissed, her hair a wild tangle. In her arms, breathing peacefully, was the pack's lost future. A gasp rippled through the hall. The keening died, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. Daxon, the beta, and his mate, Lyra, stared, their faces masks of impossible hope. They saw their children, alive. From his throne, King Rorik saw something else. Through the icy fog of his curse, a pinprick of warmth touched him. It was faint, distant, but it was there. It was the first thing he had truly felt in a decade. It did not come from the pups. It came from the girl, the human Omega, the ghost. He rose from his throne, his movements fluid and silent. The pack parted before him as he descended the steps of the dais. He ignored the pups, ignored his weeping beta. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were locked on Ilara. She met his gaze, too exhausted to be properly terrified. She simply stood her ground, swaying, her duty done. He stopped before her. The air crackled with his power, the raw, dominant energy of an alpha king. The pack held its breath. They expected him to take the pups, to perhaps offer a grudging word of thanks before dismissing the human girl back to her hovel. Rorik reached out, but not for the children. He placed a hand on the snow-caked fabric of her sleeve. The warmth, her warmth, pulsed against his palm, a direct counteragent to the frost in his veins. The relief was instantaneous, staggering. It was like a drowning man taking his first breath of air. He looked from her to his stunned pack, his face an unreadable mask of granite. His voice, when he spoke, was not a request. It was a decree, absolute and final, that echoed in the sudden tomb-like silence of the hall. "She is mine." The words were a hammer blow, shattering the fragile moment of reunion. Daxon and Lyra froze, halfway to their children. The elders of the council exchanged looks of alarm. Lord Valerius, the king's uncle and chief adviser, stepped forward, his expression one of gentle concern. "My king," Valerius began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "The girl has performed a great service. She will be rewarded, of course, but she is a human Omega, unclaimed, of no standing." Rorik's gaze flickered to his uncle, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. The casual possessiveness in his uncle's tone grated on something primal within him. "I am aware of what she is, Valerius." He turned his attention back to Ilara, who was now trembling, not from cold, but from the terrifying weight of his focus. "Her standing has changed." He made a gesture. 2 guards stepped forward, their movements hesitant. "Take the pups to their mother," he commanded. Then his eyes softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at Ilara. "Take her to the royal wing, to the chambers beside my own. See that she is given a hot bath, food, and a healer." Ilara flinched as Lyra gently lifted her sleeping child from her arms. The loss of the small, warm body was immediate and sharp. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the hours of burning her inner fire finally taking their toll. Her knees buckled. Before she could hit the stone floor, a strong arm wrapped around her waist, holding her up. It was the king. He had moved faster than her eyes could track. She was suddenly pressed against his side, and the sheer scale of him was overwhelming. He was a wall of muscle and power, and he radiated an aura of command that demanded submission. But beneath it all, there was a shocking, profound cold. It was a dead cold, a void where warmth should have been. It drank in the last dregs of her own heat like a starving man. "She is exhausted," Rorik stated, his voice a low growl meant only for the guards. "Do as I command." He released her as a stout female healer, and 2 other women rushed to her side. They supported her, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion. As they led her away from the great hall, Ilara glanced back. Daxon and Lyra were weeping with joy, clutching their returned children. The pack was murmuring, a low thrum of disbelief. And the king was watching her, his expression unchanged, a predator who had just claimed the most unlikely prey. The chambers were larger than her entire hovel. A fire roared in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on tapestries of ancient hunts. A massive bed was piled high with furs, and a steaming wooden tub sat in an adjoining room, filled with scented water. It was a level of luxury she could not have imagined. The healer, a woman named Bryn, was kind but brisk. She clucked over Ilara's frost-nipped fingers and the exhaustion that clung to her like a shroud. She helped her out of her wet, ragged clothes and into the bath, her touch gentle. "What you did?" Bryn said, her voice hushed as she washed the grime from Ilara's hair. "No one understands it. To walk into the great white death and return, with the pups warm and sleeping, it is a miracle." Ilara sank into the hot water, a groan of pure bliss escaping her lips. "They were cold," she whispered, the simple explanation sounding inadequate even to her own ears. "I just warmed them." Bryn said nothing more, but her eyes held a new respect. After the bath, she was given a simple, warm chemise of soft linen and guided to a plate of hot stew and fresh bread. Ilara ate ravenously, the food rebuilding her strength, stoking her inner fire back to a low, steady ember. When she was done, Bryn led her to the massive bed. "The king commanded you rest. No one will disturb you." Ilara crawled beneath the weight of the furs, her body aching, her mind reeling. She was no longer a ghost. She was the king's. What did that mean? Was she a prize, a prisoner, a curiosity? She fell asleep before the questions could consume her, tumbling into a deep, dreamless void. She awoke to the feeling of being watched. She opened her eyes, and he was there. King Rorick sat in a heavy chair near the fire, observing her in the dim light. He had not moved, it seemed, for hours. The firelight flickered across the hard planes of his face, making him seem both more and less real. "You are awake," he said. It was not a question. Ilara sat up, pulling the furs tighter around her. "Your Majesty!" Her voice was a croak. "You saved the heirs of my beta," he continued, his tone flat, transactional. "My pack is in your debt. I am in your debt." "I did not do it for a debt," she said quietly. They were children. They were freezing. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed his features. "Nevertheless, a debt exists, and it will be paid. You will remain here, in these chambers. You will be given anything you require, food, clothing, comfort. Your life of servitude is over." Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was more than she could have hoped for. A safe, warm place, enough food. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that it came with a price. And in return? He rose from the chair and walked to the foot of the bed. The sheer intensity of his presence made the vast room feel small. "In return," he said, his voice dropping lower, "you will stay by my side." "By your side?" she repeated, confused. "Why?" He hesitated, the first sign of uncertainty she had seen in him. "I have a condition, a persistent chill. When you are near, it abates." He was hiding something. The lie was as clear to her as the cold that emanated from him. It was more than a chill. It was a devouring emptiness. "So I am to be your personal fireplace?" The words were out before she could stop them, a flash of her buried defiance. His eyes narrowed. He was not used to being questioned. But instead of anger, a strange, grim amusement touched his lips. "An apt description, yes. You will be my fireplace." He reached out and rested his hand on the fur blanket covering her feet. Even through the thick layers she felt it, the pull. His unnatural cold drawing on her innate warmth. It was not painful, but it was a constant, draining pressure. "This is a transactional arrangement, Omega," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You give me your warmth. I give you my protection. In this court, you will need it. There are many who will not be pleased by your sudden elevation." He was right. She could already feel the unseen weight of resentment and jealousy from beyond the door. She was a disruption, an anomaly, an Omega human who had stumbled into the heart of the pack's power structure. "I understand," she said, her voice small. "Good." He withdrew his hand and the draining sensation ceased. He turned and walked toward the door. "Rest. Tomorrow you will join me in the council chambers. The pack must see that you are under my protection." He paused at the door, his back to her. "Ilara," he said, using her name for the first time. "What you did for those pups? How?" She clutched the blanket. How could she explain something she did not understand herself? "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I just did." He looked over his shoulder, his winter sky eyes boring into her. "Find out," he commanded, and then he was gone, leaving her alone in the opulent, gilded cage he had built for her. The next morning, Ilara was dressed by servants in a simple but elegant gown of dark blue wool. It was finer than anything she had ever touched. The transformation was startling. She no longer looked like a scullery maid. She looked like a lady, but she felt like an imposter. 2 imposing guards escorted her to the council chambers, a circular room dominated by a massive stone table. The king sat at its head, flanked by his uncle, Valerius, and his beta, Daxon. The other council members, a collection of grim-faced, powerful shifters, were already seated. They all turned to stare as she entered. The hostility was a physical force. "Join me," Rorik commanded, gesturing to the empty chair at his right hand. It was a seat of honor, a place no one of her station had ever occupied. Swallowing her fear, Ilara walked to the chair and sat. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the grain of the stone table. She could feel Daxon's gaze on her, but it was not hostile. It was filled with a confusing mix of gratitude and suspicion. Valerius, however, smiled at her, a thin, predatory curving of his lips that held no warmth at all. "My king?" Valerius said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "We were just discussing the miraculous return of the pups. We are all grateful to this girl. However, her presence on the council is at my command." Rorik cut him off, his voice like cracking ice. "She is under my personal protection. Any challenge to her is a challenge to me. Let that be understood by all." A heavy silence fell over the room. No one dared to argue. The king had made his decree. Ilara sat beside him, a silent observer, for the rest of the meeting. They discussed border patrols, trade disputes, the lingering effects of the storm. She understood little of it. Her only function was to be there, a warm presence beside the frozen king. Whenever his hand brushed hers by accident under the table, she felt the familiar pull, the siphoning of her energy. It left her feeling tired and a little faint, but the brief moments of contact seemed to ease the tension in his jaw, to smooth the hard lines around his eyes. Days turned into a week. Ilara's life settled into a strange routine. She ate her meals with the king, sometimes in silence, sometimes answering his curt questions about her life before. He seemed fascinated by her mundane history, by the simple fact of her humanity. During the day, she would sit with him in the throne room or the council chambers, a living ward against his secret affliction. The court was a viper's nest. Whispers followed her everywhere. The other women, particularly a beautiful high-born she-wolf named Lady Seraphina, treated her with open contempt. Seraphina had long been presented by Valerius as the most suitable match for the king, a political alliance that would strengthen his rule. Ilara's presence was an insult to her pride and a disruption to her ambitions. One afternoon, Seraphina cornered her in a corridor. "You are nothing," the she-wolf hissed, her eyes glowing with malice. "A human pet, a novelty. He will tire of you and cast you aside. When he does, you will have nowhere to run." Ilara didn't beg. She didn't cry. She simply met the she-wolf's gaze. "He is not tired of me yet," she said, her voice steady. Before Seraphina could retort, a low growl echoed down the hall. Rorik appeared at the far end, his expression thunderous. "Lady Seraphina," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Leave her." Seraphina paled and fled. Rorik strode to Ilara's side, his eyes scanning her for any sign of harm. "Did she hurt you?" "Only with words," Ilara replied. His jaw tightened. "Words can be weapons here. Do not leave my side without a guard." He was angry, but she sensed it was not directed at her. It was a frustrated, protective anger. It was another crack in his icy facade. Later that night, the true nature of his chill was revealed. She was woken by a crash from his adjoining chambers. Hesitantly, she pushed open the connecting door. The room was in disarray. A heavy table was overturned, and the king was on his knees in the center of the room, his body racked with tremors. "Get out," he snarled, his voice strained with pain. She ignored him, rushing to his side. "What is it? What's wrong?" He held up his left hand and she gasped. Crystalline ice, like a beautiful, deadly frost, was creeping up his arm from his fingertips. It pulsed with a faint, malevolent blue light, and it was spreading, branching out in intricate, icy patterns across his skin. "A curse!" he gritted out, his breath pluming in the suddenly frigid air. "It's been in my bloodline for generations. It numbs me, steals my emotions, and one day it'll freeze my heart and kill me." She could see it in his eyes, a terror so profound it had frozen over into resignation. This was his secret. This was the true reason for his coldness, his distance. He was not just emotionally closed off, he was literally freezing from the inside out. "Valerius has been trying to find a cure for years," he continued, his voice tight. "Nothing works, but your presence, it slows the spread." Instinct took over. Ilara knelt before him, took his frozen hand in both of hers. It was like holding a block of ice. She closed her eyes and focused not on the small, personal warmth she used to keep herself alive, but on something more. She reached deeper, calling on the power that had saved the pups, a wellspring of pure, generative heat she never knew she possessed. It flowed from her, not as a gentle warmth, but as a current of molten life. It poured into his hand, into the ice. The frost hissed, steaming, fighting back against her power. Rorik cried out, a sound of agony and relief mingled together. Under her touch, the crystalline patterns began to recede. The ice retreated from his forearm, down his hand, back toward his fingertips, where it held a stubborn, glittering sheen on his nails. She slumped, panting, the effort leaving her dizzy and weak. The air in the room was warm again. Rorik stared at his hand, then at her, his expression one of utter disbelief. The raw terror in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dawning, fragile hope. "How?" he breathed, his voice raw. "I don't know," she whispered, her head spinning. Her proximity didn't just slow the curse, her touch could fight it. Her power, the strange, hidden fire she had always considered a small, useless secret, was the antithesis of his curse. She was the cure. The revelation hung in the air between them, changing everything. This was no longer a transactional arrangement. It was a matter of life and death. his life and her power. And in that moment, as he stared at her, with the first unguarded emotion she had ever seen on his face, Elara knew she was in more danger than ever before. In the days that followed, the dynamic between them shifted. The pretense of a simple transaction was gone, replaced by a fragile, unspoken codependence. Rorik became fiercely protective, rarely letting her out of his sight. The acts of kindness were no longer small or subtle. He had the royal seamstresses craft her a wardrobe of warm, beautiful gowns. He brought her delicacies from the kitchen himself, watching to make sure she ate. He was not just protecting his fireplace. He was guarding a lifeline. Elara, in turn, found her own power growing. Being near the curse, a force of absolute cold and death, seemed to act as a catalyst for her own life-giving warmth. What was once an ember was now a steady flame. She could feel it, a constant hum of energy beneath her skin. She learned to control it, to push it back when the frost tried to creep up his arm during a stressful council meeting or a long, cold night. Her growing confidence did not go unnoticed. Daxon, the beta, began to watch her with a grudging respect. His mate, Lyra, would seek her out, offering her small gifts, a warm cloak, a hand-carved comb, tokens of a gratitude that was slowly overcoming her suspicion. They saw the change in their king. The hard edges were softening. A hint of a smile would occasionally touch his lips when he looked at Elara. He was coming back to them, and she was the reason. But for every ally she gained, the enmity from others deepened. Lady Seraphina's hatred curdled into something more dangerous, and Lord Valerius watched them both with a thoughtful, serpentine gaze. He praised Elara openly for the calming effect she had on his nephew, but his eyes were cold and calculating. One evening, Rorik found her staring out a high window, looking down at the snow-covered courtyard. The storm had long passed, but the world was still draped in white. "You miss the outside," he said, his voice a low rumble behind her. She started, not having heard him approach. Sometimes. It is beautiful here, but it is a cage." "A necessary one," he said, his tone grim. He came to stand beside her. The cold emanating from him was a constant presence, but it no longer felt threatening to her. It felt familiar, a part of him. "Valerius believes the curse is accelerating. The moments of reprieve you give me are shorter. The frost is more aggressive when it returns." "Is there no other way?" she asked. "No counterspell? No herb?" "We have tried everything," he said, his voice heavy with a weary resignation that tore at her heart. "For years, my uncle has scoured every ancient text, consulted every hedge witch and scholar. There is nothing." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "There is only you." The weight of his words was immense. His life was in her hands. She felt a surge of fear, but also a fierce, protective instinct. She would not let this curse take him. That night, the cold returned with a vengeance. She was woken again by the sound of his pain, but this time it was worse. She found him slumped against a wall, his breathing ragged, the frost covering not just his hand, but his entire arm, creeping up his neck toward his face. His eyes were glazed, the blue irises clouded with a chilling white haze. "Rorik!" she cried, rushing to him. He couldn't speak, could only gasp, as the ice constricted around his throat. Panic seized her. A simple touch would not be enough. She needed to do more. She threw her arms around him, pressing her body against his, her cheek against the icy skin of his neck. "No," she whispered, her voice fierce. "You will not take him." She closed her eyes and unleashed her power without reservation. It was no longer a gentle flow, it was a torrent, a flash flood of heat and life. She poured everything she had into him, picturing a sun exploding in her chest, driving back the winter. The room became stiflingly hot. A faint light emanated from her skin. Rorik shuddered violently in her arms, a choked sound tearing from his throat. The battle was immense, a war between absolute zero and her own personal star. She felt her energy draining at an alarming rate, her vision starting to speckle with black dots. She was burning herself out, but she didn't stop. Finally, with a sound like shattering glass, the curse broke. The ice didn't just recede, it cracked and fell away from his skin, turning to mist before it hit the floor. The chill in the room vanished, replaced by the clean, warm air of her effort. Rorik collapsed against her, his full weight pressing her into the wall. He was breathing deeply, his body limp but blessedly warm. She was spent, so weak she could barely stand. They slid down the wall together, ending in a heap on the floor. He stirred, lifting his head. The haze was gone from his eyes. They were clear, sharp, and fixed on her with an expression of raw, unguarded awe. "Ilara," he breathed. Without thinking, without conscious thought, he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperate, grateful reverence. His lips were soft, warm for the first time. It was a connection that went deeper than skin, a circuit of energy completing itself. Her fire met the newly awakened warmth in him, and something clicked into place in the universe, a lock finding its key. The moment was brief, but it changed the world. He pulled back, his eyes wide with the shock of what he had done, of what he was feeling. For the first time in his adult life, Rorik was not numb. He felt the softness of her lips, the frantic beat of her heart against his chest, the dizzying, terrifying surge of affection for the woman in his arms. Ilara stared back at him, her own heart hammering. The kiss had sent a jolt of pure energy through her, chasing away her exhaustion, leaving her breathless and trembling with a feeling she had never known. He started, then stopped, unable to form the words. The emotions were too new, too overwhelming. Instead of speaking, he simply held her. He wrapped his strong arms around her and pulled her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her hair. He held her, not as a king holding a subject, or a man holding a possession, but as an equal, a partner, a drowning man clinging to the shore. They stayed like that for a long time, huddled together on the floor, the shattered remnants of his curse dissipating around them. The intimacy of the moment and the power she had displayed did not go unnoticed. Lord Valerius, who had been monitoring his nephew's condition through scrying spells tied to the curse itself, felt the sudden, violent shattering of the ice magic. He felt the surge of warmth that had destroyed it. He knew with a certainty that filled him with cold fury that the human girl was not just a hindrance. She was a weapon that could undo everything he had worked for. His plan had been simple. Keep Rorik weak and dependent, his emotions frozen, his spirit broken. A king ruled by a debilitating curse was a king who could be easily manipulated. Valerius had been the true power behind the throne for years, guiding the pack, amassing influence, all while appearing to be the loyal, concerned uncle searching for a cure he had no intention of finding. In fact, he had been subtly strengthening the curse with his own dark magic, preparing for the day it would finally consume Rorik, leaving the throne vacant for a regent, himself. The girl had ruined it all. She had to be removed. His first move was subtle. The next day, during the morning meal, Lord Valerius addressed the king, his voice dripping with concern. "My king, you seem changed. The weight of your affliction appears to have lessened." Rorik, who was sitting closer to Ilara than was strictly proper, merely nodded. There was a breakthrough. Valerius's gaze slid to Ilara. Indeed, the girl's unique talents are a gift from the goddess. However, some on the council are worried. Her influence is unprecedented. A human Omega holding such sway over our Alpha King. They fear she may be using some sort of enchantment to beguile you for her own gain. Ilara flinched. The accusation was clear. Rorik's hand slammed down on the table, making the plates jump. Her only enchantment is the kindness she has shown me, he snarled. She has done more to fight this curse in 2 weeks than you have in 10 years, uncle. Perhaps the council should question your failures instead of her success. The public rebuke stunned Valerius into silence. The barb had hit too close to home. He bowed his head in mock contrition. Of course, my king, I only voice the concerns of others. My loyalty to you is absolute. But his mind was racing. A direct accusation would not work. Rorik was too protective. He needed to isolate the girl, to frame her for something so heinous that even the king's newfound affection could not save her. He found his pawn in Lady Seraphina. He met with her in secret, feeding her jealousy and ambition. The king is bewitched, he told her, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. That human parasite has him wrapped around her finger. But you are the rightful Luna of this pack, my dear. We simply need to remove the obstacle. He will never believe she would harm him, Seraphina said bitterly. He will if the evidence is undeniable, Valerius replied, a cruel smile on his face. He produced a small, corked vial, filled with a dark liquid. This is wolfsbane concentrate, odorless, tasteless. A few drops in his evening wine would not kill a shifter of his strength, but it would make him violently ill. We will ensure the vial is found in the Omega's belongings. When the king is sick and the poison is found in her room, who will he believe, the foreign human or his own blood? The plot was set. That evening, during a formal dinner, Seraphina, tasked with pouring the wine, would taint the king's goblet. The blame would fall squarely on Ilara, who, as the king's constant companion, had the most opportunity. Ilara, however, was changing. Her power was more than just heat, it was an attunement to life itself. And in Valerius she sensed a profound wrongness. It was a cold spot in the world, a void of ambition and deceit that felt chillingly similar to the curse itself. She had begun to watch him, her suspicion a quiet, gnawing thing. She noticed the way he looked at Rorik when the king wasn't paying attention, not with loyalty, but with a possessive, frustrated hunger for power. She saw the brief, triumphant glance he exchanged with Seraphina when the she-wolf approached the head table with the wine decanter. Something was wrong. As Seraphina reached for the king's goblet, Ilara felt a spike of that cold, deceitful energy. It was sharp and malicious. Her instincts screamed. "Stop!" Ilara said, her voice clear and carrying in the suddenly silent hall. Seraphina froze, her hand hovering over the goblet. All eyes turned to Ilara. "What is the meaning of this?" Rorik asked, his brow furrowed. "The wine," Ilara said, her eyes locked on Seraphina. "There is something wrong with the wine." Seraphina scoffed, forcing a laugh. "Don't be ridiculous, Omega. It's the same vintage the king always prefers." "Then you drink it," Ilara challenged, standing up. Seraphina's face paled. "I will not be ordered about by a human." Valerius rose smoothly to his feet. "My king, this is an outrageous accusation. The girl is overwrought. She is letting her new position go to her head." But Rorik was watching Seraphina, his gaze sharp as a shard of glass. He had learned to trust Ilara's instincts. They had saved his life more than once. "Pour a glass for yourself, Lady Seraphina," he commanded, his voice soft, but laced with steel. Panic flashed in Seraphina's eyes. She looked desperately toward Valerius, But the old wolf's face was a mask of detached disappointment. He was cutting her loose. Trapped, she stammered. I am not thirsty. It was all the confirmation Rorik needed. Guards, he snapped. Seize her and bring me the decanter. Serafina shrieked as two guards grabbed her arms. The decanter was brought to the king. He swirled the dark red liquid, his face grim. He did not need to taste it. The she-wolf's terror was proof enough. Why? He demanded, his voice a low growl. Terrified and abandoned, Serafina broke. It was him, she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Valerius. He gave me the poison. He said it would make you sick and we could blame the human. He said she had bewitched you. The entire hall erupted in gasps. Every eye turned to the king's uncle, the loyal adviser, the wise elder. Valerius's mask of calm finally cracked. The game was up. She lies, he roared, his face contorted with fury. The treacherous wolf conspires with the human witch to usurp me. No, Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. She stepped forward, facing the old wolf. Now that the betrayal was in the open, the coldness she sensed from him was a raging blizzard. You are the source of the cold. It's not just the curse, is it? It's you. Her growing power gave her a strange new sight. She could almost see the lines of dark magic that connected him to the affliction in Rorik's blood. You weren't trying to cure him, she whispered, the horrifying truth dawning on her. You were feeding it, strengthening it. You're the one who lured the pups into the storm, weren't you? You hoped they would freeze. You wanted to break his spirit, to weaken the pack, to leave him with nothing so you could take everything. The accusation was so monstrous, so specific, that it rang with the terrible truth. Daxon let out a guttural roar of fury, his eyes flashing amber as he started to shift. Valerius laughed, a high, unhinged sound. The facade of the wise counselor fell away, revealing the power-mad sorcerer beneath. Clever little witch, he spat, his eyes glowing with a malevolent purple light. Yes, all of it. This pack should have been mine generations ago. My brother stole it from me. I laid the curse on his line, a slow-acting poison to rot it from within, and I would have succeeded if not for you. He ripped a dark, twisted amulet from beneath his robes. It pulsed with the same icy energy as the curse. I will not be denied my birthright. If I cannot have the throne, I will leave it a frozen tomb. He thrust the amulet toward Rorik. A beam of pure, black frost shot across the room. Rorik, caught by surprise, cried out as it struck him square in the chest. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The curse, supercharged by the amulet, exploded through him. Crystalline ice erupted across his chest, spreading at a terrifying speed. He staggered back, his skin turning grey, his breath turning to a cloud of ice crystals. He collapsed to his knees, his eyes wide with agony. The warmth Ilara had fought so hard to give him extinguished in an instant. The council was in chaos. Guards loyal to Valerius drew their swords, forming a protective circle around him, while others, loyal to the king, were frozen in shock. Daxon was held back by two of Valerius's men. It was happening. The coup was in motion. Valerius raised the amulet again, preparing for the final killing blow that would freeze Rorik's heart solid. "The age of the Ice Wolf begins!" he bellowed. But he had forgotten about Ilara. She did not scream. She did not run. A wave of pure, incandescent rage washed through her, a rage born of love and a fierce, primal need to protect her mate. She was no longer a frightened Omega. She was a force of nature. She ran, not away, but toward the fallen king. She threw herself in front of him, a human shield against the coming blast. "No!" she screamed, her voice imbued with all the power she possessed. Valerius laughed. "A foolish, noble gesture. You will die with him." He unleashed the amulet's full power, a torrent of absolute zero, a wave of darkness that seemed to swallow the light, surged toward them. Ilara did not flinch. She closed her eyes, reached into the very core of her being, past the fire she used for warmth, past the power she used to heal, and touched the source of her own life force. She gathered it all, every spark, every ember, every memory of warmth and love she had ever felt, culminating in the new, fierce love she felt for the king behind her. And she let it go. It was not a beam of heat. It was a nova. A silent, blinding explosion of pure, golden light erupted from her body. It was the physical manifestation of life itself, a sun born in the heart of the great hall. The wave of dark frost struck the expanding sphere of light and vaporized. The light washed over Valerius, and he screamed as the dark magic of the amulet was annihilated. The amulet itself glowed white-hot and then shattered into 1,000 pieces. The stolen power he had hoarded for decades was burned out of him in a single, agonizing instant, leaving him a withered, powerless old man. The light washed over Rorik. The ice that encased him didn't melt. It sublimated, turning directly from a solid to a harmless vapor. The curse that had plagued his bloodline for a century, the cold that had defined his entire existence, was not just broken or pushed back. It was utterly and completely erased, burned away by the sheer, overwhelming power of her love and life force. The golden light filled the hall for a heartbeat longer, touching everyone, a feeling of profound warmth and hope. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, collapsing back into its source. Ilara stood for a second, swaying, a silhouette against the suddenly normal light of the hall. Then, her sacrifice paid, she crumpled to the floor, her body as cold and still as the curse she had just destroyed. For a moment the hall was utterly silent, the pack stunned by the display of impossible power. Then a single, ragged breath broke the stillness. Rorik pushed himself to his feet. He was whole. The cold was gone. The numbness that had been his constant companion was gone. In its place was a rushing, overwhelming flood of sensation. He could feel the warmth of the hearth fires, the cool stone beneath his boots, the frantic, terrified thumping of his own heart. And above all, he felt a tidal wave of love and terror for the woman lying motionless at his feet. He didn't hesitate. He ignored the cowering form of Valerius, ignored the shocked faces of his council. He fell to his knees beside Ilara and gathered her into his arms. Her skin was ice-cold. There was no breath, no heartbeat. She had poured her own life into saving him. "No," he whispered, the word a broken, desperate prayer. He pressed his ear to her chest, listening for any sign, any flicker. There was nothing. "No, I will not allow it." He had felt the bond snap into place the moment she had declared him hers with her sacrifice. It was no longer a faint connection, it was a blazing pathway between their souls. He could feel the echoing void where her vibrant life force had been. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. He poured his own energy into her, not the destructive cold of the curse, but the vibrant, roaring life of a healthy alpha shifter, amplified by the new, powerful emotions flooding his system. He pushed his own life force down the channel of their bond, a desperate transfusion of soul and power. "Live," he commanded, his voice a choked sob. "Ilara, live for me." He poured and poured, heedless of the cost to himself, giving her everything. For a long, terrifying minute, nothing happened. Then he felt it. A flicker, a tiny, faint spark in the darkness, responding to his call. He focused on it, nurtured it, fed it with his own strength. A shuddering gasp. Her chest rose, a single, desperate breath. Then another. Colour began to seep back into her cheeks. A faint, steady pulse started to beat against his lips. He pulled back, tears streaming down his face, the first tears he had shed since he was a child. Her eyes fluttered open. They were hazy, confused, but they were alive. "Rorik," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He clutched her to him, burying his face in her hair, overwhelmed by a relief so profound it was painful. "I'm here. I've got you." Around them, the pack finally moved. Daxon, his face a mask of cold fury, strode over to the whimpering Valerius. He didn't kill him. He hauled him to his feet. "Justice will be decided by our queen," he growled, and the pack murmured its assent. Seraphina was dragged away, her fate sealed, but Rorik saw none of it. He saw only the woman in his arms. He carefully lifted her, her body still frighteningly frail, and carried her from the hall, away from the chaos and the betrayal. He took her back to their chambers, the place that had become their sanctuary. He laid her gently on the bed and refused to leave her side. For 3 days and 3 nights he held her hand, pouring his strength into her, talking to her, telling her everything he had never been able to say. He told her about the loneliness of his frozen world, about the first flicker of warmth he had felt when he saw her in the doorway, about the terror and hope that had warred within him as he grew to need her. And he told her he loved her. He said the words over and over, letting the new, wonderful feeling wash through him. On the morning of the 4th day, she woke fully. Her strength had returned, her inner fire rekindled by his own. She looked at him, her eyes clear and bright, and she smiled. "I heard you," she said softly. "Every word was true," he replied, his voice thick. "I know." She reached up and touched his face, her hand warm against his skin. "I love you too, Rorik." All the pretenses were gone, all the transactions and bargains stripped away by fire and sacrifice. All that remained was the pure, unbreakable truth of their bond. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, slow kiss, full of promises and a future that was, for the first time, bright and warm. 1 week later, a ceremony was held in the great hall. It was not a mourning. It was a celebration. Valerius had been judged and sentenced to a life of exile in the frozen wastes, a fitting end for a man who worshipped the cold. The pack was healing, united behind their restored king. The ceremony was their formal union. Elara stood beside Rorik on the dais, not in a simple wool gown, but in a robe of white and gold, the colours of the pack's royalty. She was no longer Elara, the human Omega, the outcast, the scullery maid. She was Luna Elara, queen of the Blackwood pack, her place earned not by birth or politics, but by courage and love. The entire pack knelt before them. Daxon and Lyra, their pups standing beside them, looked at her with reverence and devotion. The skeptical allies were now her most fervent supporters. She had not just saved their king, she had saved them all. Rorik took her hand, his touch warm and steady. He looked out at his people, then down at his mate, his queen. "My pack," he said, his voice ringing with a warmth and power no one had ever heard from him before. "For a century, our line has been shadowed by a cold darkness. Today, the sun has returned." He raised their joined hands. "Behold your queen, my mate, my heart." A roar of approval shook the rafters of the hall, a joyous, unified sound that chased away the last ghosts of winter. 6 months later, Elara stood on the balcony of their chambers, Rorik's arms wrapped around her from behind. Spring had come to the northern territories, and the world below was bursting with green life. His chin rested on her shoulder, and his hands were spread protectively over the gentle swell of her stomach. "He's kicking," she said, laughing softly as she felt a faint flutter from within. "She," Rorik corrected, his voice a low, happy rumble against her ear, "is impatient, like her mother." "She is brave, like her father," Elara countered, leaning back against his solid, warm chest. The kingdom was thriving. The pack was strong and happy. The cold was just a memory, a bad dream from a former life. He turned her in his arms to face him, his winter sky eyes now filled with the warmth of a summer day. He looked at her, his queen, the mother of his future child, the woman who had walked out of a blizzard and into his frozen heart. "You saved me, Elara," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "We saved each other," she replied. He kissed her then, a deep, loving kiss under the bright sun. Theirs was a story that would be told for generations, a legend of a frozen king and the human Omega who carried a fire within her. It was the story of the bond that proved stronger than any curse, warmer than any winter.